Well, for more on the economic ties between China and Canada, we're joined by Karen Woods, Senior Associate at Solstice Public Affairs. Welcome to the show.
Welcome. Thank you for having me.
So help us understand, just how important is this trip from the Canadian perspective?
Well, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau made a trip to China last year in the G20 event, and this year certainly marked a very important milestone in the sense that he had a meeting with President Xi Jinping, and now it's a good time to follow up. And you're right in your introduction that China is Canada's second largest trading partner, but I like to remind our viewers that United States still remains our #1 trading partner, and there was about $90 billion in terms of goods that were traded between Canada and China last year, but 2/3 of that is mainly Chinese exports. So it's some sort of a one-sided trade and lopsided trade. And in that sense, securing a free trade agreement with China can actually help Canadians, especially Canadian merchandise, to access Chinese market, which they hope to bring top tourism export dollars to Canada.
So Karen, let's take a look at what's happening with the free trade talks between Canada and China. What are the main sticking points?
It's so funny because I've talked to my friends who work in think tank, who work in media, and they almost sort of start to dub this free trade talk as all talks and no actions. But of course, free trade talks don't just happen overnight. Sometimes they'll take years to develop the narrative and to finally come to an agreement. So interestingly, the Prime Minister's office released a new statement before he went to China this time. He said he will be talking about labor's rights and gender's rights, among with other wage issues in this frame of exploratory talk with free trade. And I think that's very interesting because a part of the disagreement Canada has with China is our suspicion whether or not China is going to play by the rules. And also, opposition to free trade is actually quite heavy at home. You have Andrew Scheer, who is the official opposition party's leader, came out flatly and said if the Conservative Party is elected to government, they will reject free trade agreement. And certainly that's a problem. But that doesn't mean Canada should not begin on an exploratory talk with China, which it has already, and I think that's very positive. But I think for the leadership in China, what they have to realize is that 90% of Canadians are not in favor of free trade, not because they're necessarily anti-China, but because of they're worried about their own job security. So right. I do think China has to do a better job lifting that, do a little bit of heavy-duty lifting in Canada as well.
In terms of where you see the two countries best aligned, whether it's in terms of policies on things like climate change and even industries, where do they seem to cooperate the most?
Well, I can think of two sectors that right off my head. One is, as you mentioned, climate change, and the other is clean technology. Hydrogenics was part of the delegation with Prime Minister Trudeau to China, and they have announced that they made something like $50 million investment in the next year. So there are a lot of areas for collaboration and investment. But another sector, let's not forget, is natural resource. We have the Ring of Fire in Ontario, which has unfortunately remained untapped for the past 10 years, and it's a steel-rich, chromite-rich deposit area. But the government of Ontario lacks the development dollars, and the only country that is going to buy chromite from Ontario and ship them out is China. So let's not underlook some of the great collaboration and work we can do together as two countries in the energy sector.
And also looking ahead to Xi Jinping's meeting with Trudeau on Tuesday, what can we expect there?
Well, I think both President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Trudeau will seriously talk about the possibility of an exploratory talk on free trade agreement. Whether or not President Xi Jinping will push on, a timeline is remain to be seen. But the good thing is at least two countries are not reticent to this sort of agreement. And really, as I've mentioned before, that a lot of Western countries are sort of concerned or at least suspicious about whether or not China will play by the rule once they start, trade agreement. So I do think free trade agreement at least provides some sort of provisions in place to protect Canadian interests and rights.
Now, with that being said, we know that the U.S. seemingly is retreating and starting new trade investigations against China. How do you see Canada potentially filling that void in terms of its role as a trading partner?
Well, let's not confuse. The Americans are totally is a totally different beast than Canadians. Canadians understand the importance of accessing Chinese markets, and I don't know how much your viewers understand that our NAFTA talk is almost, you know, almost came to a collapse with our American counterpart. So naturally, Canadian politicians, prime ministers, premiers are looking for secondary markets in the Orient, namely China, South Korea, Japan. So we don't want to put our eggs in one basket, and that's why there's actually real incentive, at least politically, to develop a good trading relation and trading partnership with China.
All right, well, thank you so much for your insights. Karen Woods there, Senior Associate at Solstice Public Affairs.
Thank you so much.